Where do I sign?
Okay, we're going to convene the meeting, and I will ask Mr. Rothschild if he will lead us in a pledge of allegiance.
Ready? Begin.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic which stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Do we have a quorum?
I don't know, do we need a quorum? We're only meeting as a committee,
Not a quorum.
you know, so we don't vote on anything.
That's true.
Jessica, will you please take roll?
Absolutely. Ruben? Paul is absent. Angela? Edward?
Here?
Amelia?
Oh, here?
Richard? Rafi's up. Said he was going to be here. Joel?
Here.
And then Benjamin's out.
Here.
Edward is confirmed here. Thank you.
Okay. And we'll start with the public comments for items not listed on the agenda. Is there anyone who wishes to make a public comment? Do we have anyone, Jen?
Eddie Campos?
Good evening, everyone. That was great seeing, by the way. Sounded really good. My name is Eddie Campos. I'm a member of the Southwest Mountain States Regional Council of Carpenters. I live locally. The city should incorporate language into the city's economic development element goals, policies, and implementation of measures required that the residential, commercial, or mixed-use development be built with contractors that will hire locally, pay prevailing wages, and utilize apprenticeship from state-certified apprenticeship training programs. Workforce requirement reduces construction-related environmental impacts while benefiting the local economy and workforce development. In a recent 2020 report titled Putting California on the High Road, a job climate action plan for 2030, the California Workforce Development Board concluded that that investment in growing, diversifying, and upskilling California workforce can positively affect returns on climate mitigation efforts. South Coast Air Quality Management District recently found that local hire requirements can result in air pollutant reduction. Recently, the state of California reiterated its commitment towards encouraging workforce development and housing affordability through the Affordable Housing and High Roads Job Act of 2022, otherwise known as Assembly Bill 2011, which requires projects pay workers a prevailing wage and hire from a state-certified apprenticeship program for projects meeting certain sidings, affordability, and development standards. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is there anyone else? No? Okay. I guess Travis will introduce the staff that is here today, and Woody will introduce his people who are here today. With Travis?
Yes, thank you. Travis Martin, Associate Planner. I am the staff this evening, so I'm
You're
here.
the staff today, okay.
Yes. I'll just, I'll just make the announcement now, since we're getting into this. It is not my pleasure to announce that David is no longer with us. Today was his last day with the city, so he will not be a part of the project moving forward. I will now be the point of contact. And at this time, we don't have anyone else currently on deck to be assigned to assist with this, so we're going to keep moving forward, but we do have some adjustments we are going to have to make with his loss, unfortunately. But still have myself, still have our team at Placeworks here.
I just make the minutes. I'm not going to lie.
Okay. And Woody?
Okay, Woody Chapman with Placeworks. I'd like to also introduce Jenny Yu, who is with us. Jenny is one of our great, I would say, relatively fresh. How many months have you been with us now? A year?
Less than that.
Yeah, okay. Jenny also, she, by the way, before joining us, she was with the firm that was involved in the ATP for the city, so has some knowledge of the city as well as before coming and joining us to work on the plan. Jenny had major involvement in the two elements that, in the goals and policies that you are considering here tonight. And it was, I'm looking around, we're looking for the city's parks director. I don't see her yet, but she was going to be joining us tonight as well. So that is our introduction of MAR folks.
Okay. Well, on behalf of the committee, welcome. The committee would like to welcome all of you and those especially in the audience. And our main topic today is the Parks and Recreation goals, policies, and implementation measures. And I guess we'll start with Woody, with going over the schedule and so forth.
Okay. The schedule, you will notice we had dates up here. It's all now dates to be confirmed, so you can right now officially scratch off at least the May 22nd meeting, which was when we were going to come back to the land use plan. With the changes of city staff, there are some impacts upon the schedule. We don't know exactly what those impacts are yet, but as soon as we get a better handle, because of the suddenness of the changes on city staff, who are instrumental, if you will, given that this is not a consultant-driven plan. We consider this a community-driven plan, but with indeed collaboration with city staff also in terms of putting together the pieces as well. And we're missing a couple of key pieces because we're not only Dave has left the city, but Nathan is also leaving the city this week. So as Travis is in this unusual position of being almost the entire planning department in and of himself. So I think good wishes for Travis as he moves forward on the next few months. We don't want Travis to burn out because then who's left, if you will. So so the dates of your upcoming meetings, we will hopefully delay the land use meeting no more than a month into the June period in time, which would then shift the other two meetings from what had been September and I believe October to the following months. But we will let you know as soon as we're able to work with staff and getting there. For us as a team, just so you know, relative to the overall project schedule, we are sort of expediting Travis's time to work and get the housing element done and up to the state. And Travis has been reviewing it in great detail. And we are, and Travis, I'm sure in the director's report a little bit later can bring you up to date on that, but we're pretty close to getting a document that can go to the state, et cetera, for its formal review. So once that's done, that opens the door to complete some other work that we need to move forward, if you will, as well.
So we won't be having a meeting, another one in May?
No, we will
No.
definitely not have a meeting in May.
So
you can plan
you
your
don't know at this
vacations
time, but,
accordingly, yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so.
Yeah.
Okay, so someone will give us notice.
We will, Jessica's great at communicating with you folks, and we'll make sure we have information for her that she can distribute to you folks, let you know.
Okay. Well, then, moving along, we'll get into the general plan elements. And Woody, again.
So we have two elements to address tonight. The first, I'm going to go in reverse order relative to numbering. Parks and Recreation in the document we see is Chapter 8, and Public Facilities and Services is Chapter 7. But we wanted to move forward the Public Parks and Recreation section because, again, there was a lot of discussion of it last time, et cetera. I will indicate that what you see in front of you and the goals and policies have been reviewed with the Parks Director and the park staff here, et cetera. So indeed, there's what you see here in terms of content is work beyond, it's a significant reworking of what's in your existing general plan, probably very little of it recognizable for what's in the existing general plan. It's updated fairly substantially and incorporates some new directions that are being pursued by the Parks and Recreation Department as well. Again, the director had indicated that she was going to try to be with us tonight. I don't see her here yet in the audience, and hopefully she'll be able to show up because, again, just to remind you, and this is part of the discussion we had last week, week, is the general plan puts a very high level, if you will, overview about parks, et cetera. The real technical term, the nitty-gritty, the content and the specifications comes in the city's parks master plan. And that, as I think we have a little banner at the top of this document that indicates that, is in process of being updated as well. So what you see in this document here tonight that you'll be reviewing in the goals and policies is closely tied at the hip to what the staff is working on in terms of the updated parks master plan. So some of the, I think the issues, Ed, that you brought up last time about specificity, et cetera, the specificity comes in that master plan, et cetera, that is in preparation. And staff, hopefully she will be here, will be able to sort of explain the process where they are in that preparation and their time frame as well. But the good news is we were able to do these basically somewhat concurrently, so that we did have basically goals and policies that would be leading to a parks master plan that was, inconsistent with indeed what is in the overarching master plan as well coming up. So, the master plan obviously addresses specific parks by location and name and, other strategies that we had talked about before. Any question first about that relationship before we get into the goals and policies between the two? Okay. If not, we will proceed through the same format that we did in our last several meetings in terms of basically review of the goals and policies. But I just wanted to sort of remind ourselves in this introductory slide about the sort of the intent of the Parks and Recreation element itself and the goals and policies in this section, as you can see on the slide. It's basically a plan that provides an overview of policy for the city about providing parks to support existing population and your future populations as the city grows and continues to evolve over a period of time. That you have sufficient parkland, that the parkland is equitably distributed throughout the city, so no one area, no one neighborhood, or no one community gets left out of the indeed access to park. You will see in here a recommended standard for access to parks, et cetera. Parks obviously are an element that contribute to the neighborhood beautification, indeed are also part of the health. We talked about environmental justice and health at our last meeting. If we have active places for people to recreate and be active, and also related to a trail system as well and a healthier environment. And the last bullet here on the slide is that notion and that message that it's being coordinated with the the update of the Parks Master Plan itself. This is a really conceptual diagram, which I think is really interesting because when we think about parks, it's a very broad topic. We think normally sort of about it's the green space, and it's where you have the ball fields and the courts and so forth, the picnic areas, et cetera. But there's also a inextricable relationship to a number of other topics. So you'll see here what we put together this sort of conceptual diagram that says parks and recreation framework includes the parks themselves, but it also includes the culture and the arts of the community. And tied to that, there will be, I understand, in the in the Parks Master Plan, a rather significant contribution to expansion of the arts, cultural and arts programs within the city, et cetera, and we have some basic policies on that as well. It also touches upon the recreation services of the community, trails. Trails, you're going to see more about trails probably a little bit here, but you'll also ultimately see it in circulation element because trails are kind of, it's a something for recreation, it's something for health, but it's also something relative to the circulation element, et cetera. And bicycle routes, which again, we don't get into at all here, but we will definitely be in the circulation mobility element that you'll see coming up for you in the future itself. So that's sort of an overall broad conceptual that when we think about parks and recreation, it is all these components that contribute in terms of contributing to the health of the community. So just strictly going through, this is a listing, again, as we have done before, just how it give you a quick overview of the 5 basic goals that are in this element. One, the first goal is about providing the resources, so providing the parklands. It's about creating, the places where people are going to go recreate that may be existing today, maintenance of those, as well as providing additional parklands and spaces in the future. It's in this section that there's the standard for park acreage on 1,000 per population standard, and we'll get to that a little bit later. But it's not. Goal 2 is about what we really do in those parks, if you will, in terms of programming. What are the activities? And indeed, if we think about programming for activities, you want the programming for the traditional users of the park, but you also want programming for those who may not be the traditional users, or people like special interests of youth and teens and seniors and all of the, if you will, populations that have a difficult time to actually have recreational activities as well. So 2 is about the programming. It's not about the space itself, but it's about the programming. The third goal is about the design, to make sure that they're designed in a way they're going to fit within places rather than being compatible. It's interesting that 30 years ago, whenever a park was proposed, you never ever heard opposition from neighboring groups, but now you sometimes hear opposition because of things like lighting and noise and et cetera. So the third goal is about how making sure that parks fit within and also are safe places for community residents. The fourth goal will be addressing this broad overview for multi-purpose trails. So when we think about trails, it's more than just the hiking. It's also you may have off-road bicycles within trails. You may have horses within trails. There's multiple types of users that use trails. And then the last goal is related to funding. And again, it's a high level about funding because that's one of the purposes of the park's master plan, is to have very specific and targeted funding sources for the parkland themselves. So let me go, we'll do this the same format. We'll take one goal at a time. I'll briefly overview the policies in here and then stop at that point for the committee to see if any committee has any questions, concerns that they'd like to ask, or any concerns about something that may be missing or something that you might disagree relative to a particular policy direction in that section as well. So starting with this goal, obviously, as I was commenting, this is about having parklands, sufficient parklands within the community. The goal basically reads an integrated system of parks. They are safe, they're responsive to resident needs, and they connect the various and diverse communities and are accessible to those throughout the community themselves. So the first policy is about maintaining and updating and implementing that master plan. And we do talk about a general plan with a 30-year or 25 to 30-year time horizon, et cetera. The notion of the master plan is a much shorter term document and indeed is intended to set priorities for actual improvements and again, a 5, 6, 7, 8 year time frame as well. So the first policy says you're going to be committed to doing that, keeping that plan and implementing that plan. 1.2 is the service level goal of 5 acres per 1,000. That's pretty standard within the communities. I don't have that data for me. You currently have about 3.2 acres per 1,000, as I recall. Somewhat like that. You have less than the target of 5 acres per 1,000. This is based upon national standards. It's also based upon the fact that cities can, through development fees, through what's called the Quimby Act, actually cover up to 3 acres per 1,000 in terms of the population, in terms of the funding. We talk about that as well. So that's the second is maintaining that standard. That has been a standard for a while. You're not at that standard. It's considered to be within the parks profession a normative standard that is used throughout many communities. Lots of communities don't meet that standard, but it's still intended to be something to aim for, to shoot for, based upon what is considered a healthy relationship between population and parkland. The third policy is about the fact that it's not just city parks, but it's also sharing of facilities, sharing of schoolyards, sharing of other lands that may be available on an after-hour or summertime use basis, et cetera, as they are available, et cetera. Obviously, such requires mutual agreements with those districts and those agencies for the use of those spaces. The city can't control that, but the city can enter into partnerships with these various entities, like, again, the school districts and the colleges, et cetera, because they have, you think about the college, and they have, lands that are used for recreation purposes for their students, and there's the opportunity and off peak hours, if you will, to use that as well. The fourth policy is about coordination with other agencies, such as the Forest Service, because we're surrounded indeed by lots of land that are accessible and directly accessible from the community, and any other agencies that for which you may, county parks, for example, in which you may want to cooperate and coordinate mutual programs of providing park space, et cetera. 1.5 policy is about an equitable distribution of parks within a half mile to a 10-minute walk normally from various communities. About half of your community, about 60% of your community meets that standard today. The other 40% is not within that half mile or 10-minute walk of a parkland as well. So this, again, not only would we have the standard for how many acres of parks, but also how they would be accessible to all neighborhoods. They may be integrated within neighborhoods, but obviously every neighborhood would have that accessibility, et cetera. 1.6 is basically saying that obviously all that's not going to change overnight, if you will, in terms of getting up to that standard, et cetera. So it's basically a policy that they're going to where the highest need is in the community today, where populations have greater need than others, let's say, that those would be the areas that we prioritize when one is sequencing and providing additional parkland for the future as well. A couple more policies in this particular goal is that once we have these parks, that we're going to maintain them. We're going to basically maintain and care for these over time so that they are maintained over time so they don't degrade, so that, let's say, the play equipment or the fields are basically maintained in a way that your play. I've seen so many parks, even in my own community, where you have play equipment and it's like 20 or 30 years old and it's falling apart and actually has a potential safety hazard, et cetera. So the 1.7 policy is about maintaining and keeping it up to date. 1.8 is basically saying, well, if we're going to prioritize for community needs, we're going to periodically review and evaluate those needs, not just wait to every time a general plan is prepared, but we will, through the parks planning processes, to evaluate city needs. There will be surveys, I believe, taken or may have already been taken for the Parks Master Plan that's in preparation right now, and that periodically you will basically take the temperature of the water. And one of the other kind of key reasons for that is the activities that people like to see in their parks changes over time. If we were preparing a Parks Master Plan 5 or so years ago, we would have never heard the term pickleball courts. We worked in another community recently where when we started the planning process 3 years ago, the number one priority in a park was a swimming pool. They X'd that out in the last iteration of the parks plan. They crossed out the swimming pool and replaced it with pickleball courts. So obviously keeping up with the trends in recreation programming as well. And then obviously 1.9 is that, there's a role for developers, in larger development projects to incorporate recreational facilities and parks within their facilities. There may also be this is something that's being explored by cities relative to the legality, is when you have major commercial developments, office developments, is also to have some potential, if you will, because those facilities don't have what we call the traditional nexus requirement. If you have a house and you have a population of person living there, you have what we call nexus. So there's a person who needs a park need, and for years, our laws have basically said, yes, you can assess fees for residential to pay for that parkland because that direct connection. There's been a less direct relationship to office buildings, but we're seeing more movements towards creating, if you have a significant office complex, et cetera, to also be able to require fees because you have employees that may need the recreational uses in daytime as well. So those are the policies, the first goal and policies relative to that. So I throw it back to the committee for any comments, issues, discussions, et cetera.
So I'll jump in. I have a question on 1.9. If you require residential developers to set aside lands and develop parks, doesn't that work against creating affordable housing by increasing the development costs?
They obviously develop that in their pro forma and will incorporate it. You don't want low-income projects to not have recreational facilities either. So you need to be thinking about what you're going to do to maintain the health of the population themselves. I have never heard that as an argument, to be honest, by any developer.
Well, I mean, one of the arguments against why we have an affordable housing problem is because we put so many costly impacts on the developers.
Exactly.
And I'm not arguing the fact that parks are important and should be available, but those also work to drive up housing costs.
No, understood.
And so, how do you balance those two competing priorities?
Again, it depends upon the scale of the project. If we're talking about 5 acres per 1,000, that's then a fairly healthy, if you will, base of how many residential units is contributing to that. I would say you normally have a developer's pro forma who will incorporate that within a pro forma. Again, I've not ever heard that as an argument from a developer. And I understand the concern because, again, I think there is a justifiable concern about development fees relative to the impact upon affordable housing. I believe we have some flexibility in the housing element relative to that specific issue, too.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. If nothing else on that element and goal, let's go back to the use and the programming of the facilities themselves. So the first one is basically.
I do
Oh,
have
I'm sorry,
one question.
I'm
I'm sorry. Chairman, I have one. Just we have, off of 40, there's a number of, there's large spreading basins. These spreading basins would be obviously owned by other agencies. I was just wondering if the parks program took that into consideration, these large spreading basins, because they offer tremendous opportunities for open spaces. They do.
It's one of the things we did, and we're going to see more and more of that with the detention basins and the water issues, et cetera.
Right.
I have a great photograph of a series of detention basins in the Sacramento area, which we also know about their flooding concerns up there, et cetera, that have water in them during the winter, but they're dry in the summer. And in the summer, they're used for sports facilities and recreation. They cannot accommodate any permanent structures, but you can accommodate the kind of structures that you can bring in on a portable basis, et cetera, for those as well. So, yeah, and that's one of the reasons we have this policy in here about the multi-agency coordination, is basically that's something I think you'd want to look at. That opportunity because they are sizable and they can provide just in sheer acreage a significant addition to that acreage.
There is one spreading basin just a number of 100 feet from my home, and volunteer people on their own have provided benches and trees just to make them more amenable for people who are using these places. And it's beautiful that these people on their own accord have provided bench seating and trees. Those are those simple amenities that make the changes to those places that are helpful also. Just
Yeah, in the-
FYI.
In the old days,
It doesn't have to be like a,
in the old days, you used to put fences around them.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
wanted to keep the people out. But again, more contemporary approaches are being able to multi-purpose those as well,
Right,
to make them
right.
an asset of the community rather
Right,
than a
exactly.
negative. You do want to keep the people out in the winter when it's full of water, but you don't want to necessarily keep them out when you, other times of the year. And they do dry up. Okay?
Kind of like we brought up a couple of meetings ago, all those areas are flood control. Flood control is controlled by a very strict U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And the county flood control works for the Corps of Engineers. So they can't do anything without approval from Corps of Engineers either. And they don't want that to happen. I mean, this is our land, this is with our control, and you know, like, a lot of people thinks the Twin Creeks area is a off-road reservoir, but it's not. And so just to clarify it, and that you drive all around, you say, oh, this great area, but Corps of Engineers just won't bend, at least from what I have found.
Yeah, well, I think we can clarify this in the policy, especially on the flood control mechanisms. It's usually you have the caveat to not impede the intent to use for, that any use would not impede the intended use for flood control purposes as well. And detention basins are really not flood channels in the same way that the spreading grounds that the flood channels are, because flood channels have volumes of water that are coursing through, velocity, et cetera, where the detention basins, you spread out the water and it just basically settles there. And there are times of the year they're completely dry. And so you have that opportunity to reuse them for other purposes as well.
And I'll just add that there will be additional conversations about this in the open space element that's going to happen later on. And that's going to talk about like what we can do about the open space, which is like including conserving it, preserving it, and also like converting potentially some of them into the parks. So like as Woody pointed out in the framework earlier, Parks and Recreation includes all of these other elements, all of these components that are also discussed in other elements as well. And I just wanted to point that out.
I have a question. On the goals, number 1, parkland resources, sufficient and diverse parks to support the community. Now, does that mean that depending on the area, the parks are going to be modified according to the community? Or is it going to be across the board? You're going to include programs, trails, pony rides, arcades, you know, any type of activities there?
That is a question to the Parks Director and their Parks Master Plan, because again, that is not defined here in a general plan level. That's one of the purposes of the, in fact, we're going to programming in the facilities now, but that is one of the intentions of the Parks Master Plan, to make those kinds of decisions. And I think normally you will see that parks, if you will, are designed for different purposes. Different locations and different parks may have different purposes, et cetera, for those as well. But again, that'll be your Parks Director, and the Master Plan will begin to focus on that.
I think she's back there.
Come on up.
And so my concern is when I go to several parks, I see some parks are pet friendly, some are not. I see some that have basic activities and some that don't have any programs. I think they should all be the same, pretty much. Even if it's a smaller version, they should have accommodations for everyone, depending on the area, should not be a factor. I see that in some areas, they put in prime equipment, and in some, they just don't even care. I think that's not right, and they should have them all the same. Plus, in the apartment industry that I am, there are specific rules when they don't have playgrounds, so they don't have areas so kids can go out and play. The parks and recreations are what they depend on. So I believe they should create programs for everyone, every size, every culture, and also including ADA, since I've seen some of the parks are not ADA equipped either.
Go ahead, Liddy. And then also, I gave it probably a really bad introduction to what a Parks Master Plan is versus a general plan, et cetera. I said, you get to do the specific, the fun stuff.
Great.
While we
So
do
there
this
you go.
very high-level overview.
Well, nice to be here. My name is Liddy Gutfeld. I'm your Parks and Recreation Director here for the City of San Bernardino. I think I'll break it down into a few things. So number one, what we're doing with the master plan. We kicked off our initial community meetings here last month. We are working with Next Practice Partners, a nationally renowned organization that focuses specifically on parks and recreation master plans. When you ask about what we're going to be doing in each of the parks, as far as equity and access goes, that is the highest priority of our master plan. We'll be the first master plan in the nation to actually have what we're calling a tri-language and equity approach. And so we're having a full inclusion audit done on all of our parks, all of our community centers, just to see what is perceived by somebody who walks into our doors, what the needs are of our community that walk through those doors, as well as come to our parks. Everything from the way you park, to the way you play, to the way we program. So that is all going to be touched on in our master plan. The other thing that I want to really focus on is looking at the level of play and the level of safety in our parks. And so what we're hearing a lot from our community in these meetings is, number one, the lighting, number two, the restrooms, number three, the shade. So with all of those, we're going to make sure that no matter what age group, we're going with an intergenerational approach. So it'll be equity for all cultures and all ages, but also making sure that if you're a baby, you're going to have a changing table that your mom can change you on. And if you're an older individual who might have some incontinence issues, that we're going to have a restroom available for you to use. Also some nice walking areas and lit areas all throughout our parks.
There you go. That's basically what we need.
There you go. Any other questions?
Question, I was playing tennis at Harris Park.
Yes.
I was used to homeless issues at Harris Park.
Mm-hmm.
And several times while playing there, I was confronted with several homeless people. So, what's in that?
So the Parks and Recreation Master Plan, though, our goal for our department, we are not the individuals who are going to handle all of the homeless issues. It's a much broader issue than just Parks and Recreation. Our goal is presence, safety lighting, security, when possible. So if we have a security company, we're working on a park ambassador program as well through the master plan, just to make sure that we have a presence that's there. But we're also working with community economic development and the homeless outreach folks to make sure that we're putting together the plan that gives us that threshold of 60%, so we have the beds, so we can start enforcing encampment laws.
Honestly, it's hard to feel safe, especially for kids when they're there at 6 or 8 o'clock at night.
Yeah.
It's not, you don't feel safe there.
You're not alone in your thoughts. It's being well heard and well documented, and that's why it's a priority. Anything else? All right.
Thank you, Liddy.
You're
We'll
welcome.
probably be calling you back.
Be right back.
Don't run away. I've been thinking a little more about, Joel, your comment, and I think maybe it's important to maybe add some language to 1.9 policy about developer contributions to actually bring up the issue to not impede the development of needed affordable housing or something of that nature in terms of development fees, because I think that's an important point that you made, and we want to make sure relative to that objective. Again, we talked earlier about consistency among plan elements, and we have an element that says let's create some housing that's affordable. So I can go back and modify some language here. I think that'd be appropriate to add into this as well. Okay, goal 2 is about the programming, and this, I think Liddy just talked about some of the things that really also relate to this particular topic and this particular goal. So it talks about, if you again read the actual wording of the goal, it talks about a diverse and inclusive recreational programming that fosters community engagements and provides enriching programs for residents. So again, that nature of diversity and equity resonate throughout, I think, most of these policies themselves beyond the goal. So the first policy under the programming goal is about letting people know about the recreational facilities. I was actually surprised at one of our early community meetings about how somebody approached me and did not know that there was a park that they could go to in their neighborhood, if you will, that has particular programs. They just did not know that. So I think indeed the first, the 2.1 is basically focusing upon providing information systems, means of communication channels to let individuals and the community know. 2.2 is actually a little bit of what you were just discussing, and that's that there's a diversity of recreational amenities and programmings that are available to the community and meet that particular need as well. 2.3 is a policy basically indicating they're going to work with other groups, just as we did earlier about creating the facilities. There are other groups that may provide organizations. AYSO is a private organization, soccer leagues, et cetera. So there are indeed cooperative relationships with other entities and organizations, CBOs, it may be others, businesses, other stakeholders, to provide activities that align with the city's goals for, et cetera. 2.4 is saying one of the great things that makes a great community, it's maybe basically above and beyond just the, if you will, the recreational uses, is hosting community events. As I drove in today, I saw the food festival banner up, et cetera. That's a great community event. And then there are others, we had the Route 66, since we've been here, the art fairs and other kind of community events, which create the opportunity for, in fact, it's a socialization event as well as being an event, et cetera. The policy on 2.5 is about engaging, I think, again, I like the term that Lydia used about an intergenerational approach, that indeed providing the programs for youth, seniors, basically every age level, family types, programs, et cetera. And then the 2.6 is really a pairing off of that, because it really talks about those who have special, if you will, needs relative to recreation. You may have some individuals who have physical handicaps who are unable, that's one of the reasons we have the ADA, et cetera, but those who may find it more difficult to participate in recreational programs, and that there is supporting those who have those particular needs. Three more policies relative to this particular goal. We just said this, inclusive recreation. Probably don't need to recreate it or repeat that. 2.8 is about continuing the commission that's in place and the role as an advisory body for recreation and human services in the city. And then also 2.9 recognizes that these parks or places are community centers. They can become the hub of indeed of a neighborhood or a place, et cetera. So it's perceived as being a place where people gather, where people have community events and activities as well. So any comments, questions on this set of policies for the goal?
I've lived here since 2003. I don't know if maybe I missed it, but I haven't seen a parade here in the city of San Bernardino. I mean, have we ever had a parade here in the city of San Bernardino? I have not seen a parade, like an event here.
I hear a volunteer to organize a parade.
I live in Almani, and one of the big things about Almani, the state of Almani, was their Almani Day, Almani Pride Day. And I used to be I went to Almani High School. The band, the Almani band, played through was a leading element as part of that Pride Day of Almani. Maybe we get the high school involved in the celebration, the parade here in San Bernardino. That collectively brings the community together.
It does. I grew up in such a community. I grew up in Pasadena. We had a parade. Our relatives inundated our house every year. We didn't like the parade at that point. Okay, anything else on this section? Okay. Goal 3 is about the design and the actual physical creation of the place and the qualities of that space, et cetera. 3.1, I think, is we're finding some really effective, some really great park planning that's going on by engaging the community as a part of being part of the design team, et cetera. So bringing the community together to have, if it's a park within a neighborhood, that they're at the table. They're working with the city staff and the consultants, whoever else you may have on board, the landscape people, to actually help you design and lay out the configuration of the park as well. So there's 3.1's about engaging that community in that process. 3.2 is fairly obvious. It's about safe design of parks. There are various standards that are used, et cetera. You may have lighting, you may have, the new park in downtown Santa Monica is a real problem, a really incredibly wonderful design park right across from City Hall, but it's very unsafe because they have clusters of, the dense vegetation of trees creates places where people hang out and do unsafe things, if you will. So indeed, there are principles in terms of how one lays out relative to lighting, safety, monitoring, et cetera, parks to keep them safe places for people to be. The third is because parklands can be extending into some of those spaces we talked about before, such as the detention basins or into the base of the foothills or into another natural terrains. You have the park out east that has a lot of topography associated with it as well. And that you design and develop the parks to actually relate to that geography, et cetera. You think about Griffith Park in Los Angeles, a much bigger park, et cetera, but how the activities are really well designed to fit into that natural environmental setting and not disturb the natural environmental setting as much as possible, or that open space character of that as well. 3.4 is dealing with the minimizing the impacts. So I talked before about sometimes the community opposition, neighbors opposing due to parks, is basically designing and managing the park so that you don't have those impacts. You know, deals with things like noise and lighting and sound. Well, noise and sound are the same thing, but indeed how that compatibility, and you would take that into consideration. And security, because one of the other concerns we've sometimes hear about parks is if you have an active ball field, it's right next to the backyard of somebody. Much consciously about designing your parks now to be more sustainable. Think of the issues of climate change. So we're thinking about different types of landscapes and different kinds of vegetation, et cetera, and how we manage stormwater and stormwater runoff and within the park, et cetera, and how we conserve energy through those as well. 3.6 is also recognizing that one of the issues of climate change is heat. And we've always had, we're in a warmer part of the climate here in San Bernardino, but heat continues to escalate, and indeed making sure that we integrate some kind of shade structure so that we can have year-round use of the parks, facilities and considerations, be that trees or other types of shading devices, et cetera. 3.7 is, again, related to some of the other, let me jump ahead to the next slide, thank you, is about designing the parks for all ages and all groups, and that really relates to it, maybe a little bit redundant with an earlier policy about the inclusiveness of the park. So we talk about ADA accessibility here, we talk about play for younger children as well as adults, et cetera, of all ages, et cetera. 3.8 was, I think, what we just heard a few minutes ago about encouraging community tree planting, et cetera. We knew you were going to be here, et cetera. So any commentary? We're reading your mind, Ruben. So any, if you will, any comments or questions on this particular set of goals and policies?
So I have one suggestion for 3.6. Does it make sense to not just include shade, but also include making these cooling centers for heat emergencies through, you know, misting, heating, that's cooling, that sort of thing?
I think that's a yes.
Okay, thank you.
again, that's going to be part of the sustainable, the recycled water and the reuse of water that basically is indeed drought tolerant and all the other kinds of components of that. Nothing else in this? Okay, let's move on to the trails. And again, I said this is really a precursor to, this is really thinking about the recreational use of trails. There will be other kind of components that come up in the mobility, else, et cetera. The 4.1, 4.2, and 4.3 are really all to the same basic intent. And that's the policies that basically says have a trail system. They have a trail system within the community that may extend into the forest areas where it's appropriate, but it's a multi-purpose trail system that may use your creeks, it may use into the mountains, it may be indeed along other areas. Part of that trail system and able to do that provides obviously collaborative agreements and relationships with the county, with the Forest Service, et cetera, because a trail, you don't want to have gaps, which means some may go through some unincorporated areas, et cetera. So normally you'll have a trails master plan, a multi-purpose trail master plan. And then also the notion of a green belt system, which is related to the trails, et cetera, which basically, we so much think about when we are working on plans and development of communities about roadway networks, that, you know, that's a spine that everything sort of holds on to. But I always like to think about and visualize this as another type of spine, and that's that green spine that everything trails to, et cetera, be it greenways, green belts, be it the park systems, be it the trail system, that all create sort of another sort of way to give form and character to a community, et cetera. It's that overall network of spaces. I think, you know, historically planners look to the great Chicago plan, the Daniel Burnham plan, which is all based upon a network of greenways and green spaces as well. We're obviously significantly built community, so we need the pieces of that that can be achieved with what we have remaining, I think, in San Bernardino, et cetera. So for the first 1, 2, 3 policies are about creating that trail system, having a trail plan, having the greenways as well. 4.4 is about the use and right-of-way where we have. Now, this sometimes is feasible and sometimes less feasible, but, you know, they're utility right-of-ways. They're, again, I think the issue that Ed brought up, or Paul brought up, or one of you brought it up about the issue about, you know, some of these, if you will, like flood control channels, there's very strict restrictions on those as well, but certain things like utility easements, there may not be, indeed, because we have these corridors that are left open because of the overhead utility lines, and those can be used for greenways and trail systems as well. In fact, are pretty much a natural for having that kind of system within it as well. Basically, 4.5 is that there would be, where appropriate, and this is going to be more, again, on lands adjacent and probably more into the hillside areas that we think about, the areas that any new development project, let's say it's a project of the hills that Richard just shared with me a little earlier, that type of project where you have, you know, hundreds of residential units or a planned residential development, et cetera, you would condition approval of such a scale in those kinds of location to have access to trails. That would be a provision that would be required, et cetera. You want to make sure the trails, because most of these trails do go through natural areas, do not have adverse impacts upon natural setting of the vegetation, and the wildlife, which is 4.6. 4.7 is that the trails ultimately be designed to multiple users. Some trails may have wheelchair access, for example. Others may have just bicycles. Other may be horses, et cetera. And you design these depending upon the use and the function of the multi-use trail for safety for each of those kinds of users, if you will. So those are the, at least, working policies and the goal for trails. Any comments or questions?
Woody, I got just on trail design 4.7. I live in the foothills of San Bernardino, and there are some great mountain views there where I live. But often just trying to find the entry to a trail is difficult.
Signage.
There are no signs, there are no ID markers, nothing around the city. Whereas if you go to San Bernardino or, Big Bear, you'll see, you know, entry signs for trails. And that's really I really feel that it needs to be improved. There's nothing to show where an entry starts for a trail. That'd be nice.
I think that's important. A really different, totally different context, and I'm sure you're all familiar with the attempt to turn at least portions of the LA River concrete channel into something more of a recreational asset and greening, and there are some green areas along the river now.
Because you certainly don't want to go through someone's property to get to the mountainside.
There are some great signs out there, pieces of public art. They've turned the sign itself into an artist competition, and artists have actually created that. So it creates that identity with the community because it's the local artist who actually created the entry sign, et cetera. Yep.
Just, I was thinking here as we're talking about this. Edison, I think you've touched it, but I'll just kind of go into it a little further. Edison has easements that are enormous. I mean, I've seen some that were just, you'd amaze. You were, and right down the middle of very heavily populated areas. And there's other easements as well. Is that as, because they were used for public use, but because there is a fear or a danger of overhead wires
Yep.
and all that.
Exactly.
Is that very common now to use those easements?
It's minimally used. I mean, it's for very low-intensity trail uses at best. Again, the first key is getting Edison to agree to have the use. It depends upon the width of the right-of-way. The greater the width of the right-of-way, the greater the potential the possibility. But there is still the fear of, I've seen some communities attempt to, in their park planning, use the space below the overhead wires for parkland use and recreational uses and shy away from that for that fear. I don't know if there's ever been any conclusive, finding of the impact, but it's a concern.
Yeah, because there was some other parts of the country, or the areas, but huge Edison easements going down to the power plants. And just consuming.
Yep.
We used to ride dirt bikes in those areas until we got caught. But I just wanted, so it's really being shied away from then.
Yep.
Wow.
There's a reason, and public is shying away from it as well, because there have been some concerns. There have been the concerns about cancer and other disease as a relationship as well. There's just the general safety concern as well about, the fact that that's a very high voltage conveyance above you.
Well, also the water district has the water district owns the land. I've walked my dog through it. It's a great trail, and unfortunately, I mean, a lot of it is locked. You can't get through it because the water district doesn't want you to transfer. But there's some great roadways, but owned by the water district that I've used myself. Yeah.
Yorba Linda has a huge trail and it's owned by the water district too.
Yeah.
It's wonderful.
Wonderful. Yeah.
I think
beautiful.
there are
And
opportunities to
scenic
look
also.
at, again, they're not necessarily lands that are in ownership today, let's say, by the city, but there are opportunities, again, for joint uses for some of those facilities, absolutely.
Somehow we managed to connect from city to city. I think that Yorba Linda's, I don't know all the way, but it ends up either Newport.
Are you referring to the Santa Ana River? Oh.
Regional Park area, and so it starts, there's a trail there that starts there and ends up all the way, I believe, to Newport Beach.
Yeah, I think yeah, it's the same one that the city has, the Santa Ana River Trail. Yes, you have the Santa Ana River, and there is a design phase for it.
It's not completed.
It's in progress.
For a couple of decades.
In theory, you can jump on bike trails, or you may have to make them your own, at 40th Street and ride all the way to Newport Beach. Some of it is unbelievably
On the Santa Ana
longer
Trail,
Santa
yeah.
Ana River. It's huge.
Yeah. Exactly.
But in theory, you can do that. In fact,
Yep.
I'd have a cousin that did that once.
It's functionally feasible,
Yeah,
put it that way.
that's a good way of putting it.
Somewhere safe where, you know, cars are not around, because then you have children, you know, pets, and that concerns the seniors, and sometimes, you know, riding a bike in San Bernardino doesn't appeal to me because of the way the driving
Yeah.
ethic is around here, but they should have trails where they're not surrounded by highways or anything of that sort.
And for bicycles, we'll be talking more about that when we get to the mobility element. Okay, if nothing more on this policy, we'll go to the last policy under the parks section, and that's about paying for this, et cetera. We talked a little bit about the development fees earlier and have a caveat for that we'll embed into the policies. We also, 5.1 is about the fact that every so often there's surplus public land that's not going to be used for any other purpose and just sort of sits idle. So it basically says that where feasible, that is an opportunity to think about acquisition where that is the case. The 5.2 repeats that developer fee contribution. We'll amend that accordingly as well. But again, also in the past, some parklands have been gifts and dedications from people have provided. You know, Griffith Park in LA was a gift from a very wealthy individual to the city of Los Angeles, and that still does occur. The 5.4 is that the basically the programs, so the 5.1, 5.2, 5.3 deals with actually the acquisition of lands for parks, the funding of that, et cetera. 5.4 goes to that second policy we had about programming and the use of the facilities and the events and the activities that are going on. So it's basically the city will have funding as they do now for those as well. This is again a little bit redundant, but the 5.5 is about the shared resources with the other stakeholders, the community-based organizations, et cetera, for the programming of activities. Here again, we're like AYSO is a good sort of corollary for this as well. 5.6, this was in the existing policies. We kept it here. And we probably think it maybe isn't needed, but we have a separate conversation with staff about this particular one. I don't know why this was in the existing general plan. Having a specific line item for janitorial services, and if you need that, I think that belongs more in the master plan than it would in terms of general plan policy as well. 5.7 is basically evaluating again the moving ahead on the next series of et cetera, is to evaluate the parks today for their safety and issues of safety, and indeed to implement and fund improvements that may be needed to improve the safety, and that means physical safety as well as safety from crime as well, any aspects of safety that may impact their use, et cetera. 5.8 is that over time, and this again would be a appropriate subject for the master plan for the parks, is that we again are finding that parks are beginning to replace the vegetation that used to be water intensive and replacing it with other native species and drought tolerant species, et cetera. And particularly focusing, again, when we talked about priorities earlier, is looking at those parks where the landscape has deteriorated over time and is not being well maintained. 5.9 is the capital improvement programs. I think most of you are familiar when I use the term capital improvements. It's the annual budgeting program of the city to provide for all infrastructure and other services that they provide. Indeed, that recreational facilities continue to be a part of that budgeting process within the city. And then obviously, we also, I say obviously, but what's growing, we're finding, is increasingly there are private organizations and other entities for which you can apply, and state organizations, et cetera, apply for grants to actually fund improvements. Our staff just completed, 6 parks in South LA? I think it was that nature, under a state grant for improvements of South LA parks that are pretty amazing facilities that just recently were improved. But there was also through a grant, a program, a state funding grant for parks and recreation improvements within the communities and needed communities. And I would think that there would be tremendous opportunities in San Bernardino for similar kind of grants programs to fund improvements.
I have a question. Would that include water parks? Because we don't have any here.
You don't have any what, I'm sorry?
Water parks.
That again would be something you want to.
Water parks.
Lita will talk.
Water
parks.
Is there a plan for that? I mean, we burn up in heat around here. They need something like that.
So water parks as in splash pads or legit like Wild River water parks?
Wild River, wild parks. What we had at Splash, was it Splash Mountain?
So we have Jerry Lewis Family Swim Center, which has the water slides and an extensive splash pad area, which is actually in the books to be redone in the next fiscal year. So that is our big water slide. We are adding water slide-ish amenities, so more play amenities at our pools. We have 6 pools. So we're looking at updating those. The priority, though, however, for all of the pools is heaters. We don't have any heaters in our pool, so we can't teach kids how to swim, which then reverses the effects. So our cooling centers are obviously our community centers, our splash pads throughout the city, and I think we're up to 13 that are functional. So we do have cooling areas with water elements, but the actual water slides will be housed right now only at Jerry Lewis.
Any thought into having something huge like a Splash Mountain type of thing?
Not at this time.
Not at this time.
Yeah.
Okay.
Again, remember thinking about budgeting of these, that, you know.
Well, that would also generate
obviously-
money in the summer.
Yeah.
It would also generate tons of money, especially for those that don't have
That's
any
true.
pools. So that would be a concept that the community can enjoy and have fun and continue, maybe have annual passes, membership passes, anything of that sort of nature, to keep the funds going to actually reinvest in it as well. So that would be something nice to see around here. I'm sure the community will enjoy anything of that sort of nature.
And that is one of the priorities, like I said, when we're going to fix the slide. We do run into people who can't afford to even come in just for a $2, rec
Right.
swim, which includes the slide amenities. If anything, we would probably just expand on the area just because it's centrally located instead of building a massive facility, at least for right now, for the priority.
Right now, that'll work. Thank you.
Okay, we'll move on to any other comments on this section, funding.
Jim
On
Penman?
Parks and Recreation?
Yeah, Jim Penman.
Growing up in San Bernardino, our parks were one of the finest aspects of our city. Most of us learned to fish at Second Lake. We hiked at Paris Hill Park. Families were there constantly. We took our children there. Paris Hill Park, our premier park, followed by Second Lake, Nunez, Plunge at Delman Heights, so many others, and I'm not mentioning some of them that I know I should be. But other than the Chaz Kelly created parks in Vermont, I would not take my grandchildren to any of our parks. In my days in office, the main problem was the drugs and prostitution. Today, those 2 problems remain, but the homeless overrides everything. You look at Paris Hill Park, and all you see is a forest of tents. The reception of the general plan portion of the parks is going to be looked at very derogatorily by most citizens, because the churches I attend, the service clubs, American Legion, fraternal organizations, neighborhood meetings, everybody says, close the parks. We can't use them. We can't take our kids there. Just close them. Stop watering them. Turn off the money. I don't agree with that personally, but I'm not in the majority of comments that I hear. it's very sad to hear the public say those things about our parks, but the truth is, the average citizen either cannot or will not use them. And as I sit here and listen to what to me sounds like very grandiose plans, I know how they're going to be received by the public. The people just shake their heads, and it's a constant point of comment that we hear at the neighborhood associations, the various gathering places. A parks component section of the general plan really needs to make some comments about the homeless and what intends to be done. The third most common complaint is that so many of the parks you can't use the restrooms. Certainly you hear that at Nunez Park on the west side. Constant complaints about that the restrooms are bolted, they're locked. If for the public to have confidence and restore the public's confidence in the parks, we've got to fix them. And that is probably why the janitorial part was in the general plan, the last general plan for the parks, was because it's been an ongoing problem because the infrastructure of the toilets at the parks and other parts is so degraded and was many years ago. Thank you.
This will be goal part 3.7, design for inclusiveness. Maybe it's the question for the answer by the director parks. Starting to provide a spectrum of services for the parks. At current budgets, does the park department budget provide have the funds for inclusiveness of providing programs and other services throughout the system right now or in the future?
Well, okay, loaded question. So let's, inclusiveness, our model that we are currently doing right now, which is we have our community centers, which have minimal programming happening. We have our special events, which are really the heart of what Parks and Recreation is doing, our nationally awarded festival event, the Christmas, on Court Street that we did with the ice skating rink, those types of things that can continue. Our camps will continue. Our aquatics programs are being able to happen because of our budget. Now, are we at a level where we can't go any further? No. We have definitely the easy probability of growing. We just need to be able to have the parks in place that are safe.
So I appreciate we're staff at we have adequate staff levels at this time for the most part.
I would say the majority of our programs have adequate staff. The only place where we're hurting tremendously is our lifeguards for our aquatic center.
Got it. Thank you.
How about using something about safety for the parks, such as Mr. Penman's comment? We don't have to mention homeless because it could be whatever, but it is true that those problems of homeless, drug use, not afraid to use the bathrooms, and just anything, because you feel like you go to the park to have a picnic and whatever, and then homeless are coming around asking for food and so forth. So can we somehow put safety as to ensure the safety of community residents by, utilizing the resources that we do have, police and so forth, to keep them clean and safe for the public's use?
Absolutely.
And I didn't know
that resonated with me, and I've been writing some notes here on this after Mr. Penman made his comments, because I think, again, regardless of having 5 acres per 1,000 or 10 acres per 1,000, if they're not places where people want to go, it's a meaningless place, and it's a meaningless expenditure. So we've just been talking about adding some additional policies relative to that particular topic about making them safety. We have one through the design through safety, but I think it needs more than, I'm just looking at it right now, policy 3.2. I don't think the 3.2 gets to it. It just talks about patrolling and monitoring parks, but I think there's much more that we can provide for in terms of policy
Okay, so
correction.
it will be added there.
It'll be
because-
added.
Because all the other things are good, but if we don't take care of those
Exactly.
or address them, they're not going to happen.
Exactly.
Okay.
So I'm glad we
Thank-
heard the comments tonight.
thank
That's very
you.
helpful.
Thank you. Okay, then we can move on.
Okay,
There's no other questions.
so we'll move on from Chapter 8 backwards to Chapter 7 to the public facilities and services. And let me just sort of up front is when we talk about public facilities and services, there are all lots of public facilities and services. So really the focus of this particular section is really on three topics, on what are the police and fire or community safety services to the community, about education, because that's a service to the community, our schools and our how we educate, which is also tied to some of the policies that were in the economic development element that you talked about at your last meeting as well, and then the notion of the visual arts. So the real focus is there rather than covering health and all these other public facilities and services, et cetera. Other than that is sort of broadly addressed as a element, et cetera. So that the policies are basically dealing in those sections. So as you see up here on this screen, there are basically 7 basic goals related to this. Excuse me. The first is dealing with police and fire and the services that are provided by them, and with the basic goal of your residents are protected, et cetera, for natural hazards and from crime. The second goal, PF2, is dealing with new opportunities and continuing opportunities that every age level has access to education and is well educated. And when I say every age level, it also includes such things as adult education and moving up the ladder in terms of education. PF3, the third goal, is dealing with the community arts and culture, et cetera, and emphasizing how important a program that has anybody who's been involved in the downtown plan knows how the arts have been very much integrated and are being integrated into the downtown specific plan, et cetera. The fourth goal is really this broad level about all the services that are offered in the city, those that we just mentioned, but any other services, health, et cetera, are provided at a high quality. The fifth is similar to the parks in that what we just talked about. It's the design and operation, maintenance of facilities, et cetera. The sixth is we're deciding what are the community facilities, services being provided for the communities. It's basically tasking the city to involve the community and receive input in terms of defining what those services are going to be. And then like parks, the seventh goal is about financing of facilities themselves. So let me start with the police, fire services, et cetera. There are 6, I believe, basic policies associated. There's actually a few more based upon that. There are 11 policies related to this as well. So let me go through these quickly, also in the time. But I think the first one is response time. This is sort of a given in every general plan that there is a period of time that is established by the police and fire department so that if there's an emergency, they have their standard that they will aim for, target to basically be there within X number of minutes of the actual event and being notified of the event. So this is basically a directive policy that those standards be established by the relative agencies and are maintained and becomes a standard for service as well. There is 1.2 is the fact that when you provide police and fire service, it's not just the city of San Bernardino, but in many emergencies you have mutual aid agreements with other adjoining cities as well as with the county. So that we know when we have a fire in the mountains that it's not just the city fire engines that are up there, but it's other agencies and other departments as well. 1.3 is what's called community-based crime prevention, such as Neighborhood Watch, other groups. This is basically saying that when we provide safe communities, it's not just about having a police department doing it, but it's about having an educated population who also has, indeed, programs to look at and protect their neighborhoods, because we cannot have policing everywhere in every location, et cetera. 1.4 is a policy about early intervention, recognizing that if we have problems at a very young level in terms of youth, that you want to intervene and create opportunities for addressing the issues at a very young age, rather than waiting until they are 30 years of age and doing something worse, et cetera. The 1.5 is that development projects are assessed to pay for what services they need, are basically requiring for them as well. That's sort of normal in any development agreement process that goes on. 1.6 is that development applies codes. You have fire safety codes that you must adhere to, building design, building standards, et cetera. There is a specific policy here recognizing that in the downtown area, there's the opportunity for additional what we might call high-rise structure. And there are also special fire safety standards that and programs for that it's not only the actual design of structure, but being in a office building that's like 30 stories high, we have fire drills every couple of months. So it's not only the design, but it's also a program to alert the tenants, et cetera, and to actually have them practice. Similar to office buildings, we want to have safety programs for schools. It's a big topic out there these days, et cetera. 1.9 is that we have a uniform reporting of fire emergency data and what are the causes of fire. Sometimes that doesn't happen, and we get different ways and different forms of reporting the data, but if you're going to basically create a program to address fire hazards, you want to know what the causes are in a uniform manner, that they're not described differently, et cetera. 1.10 is strictly you're going to provide enough staff to provide for the levels of service that are needed for both the police and fire personnel. Over time, 11 is basically a policy that periodically you're going to review the effectiveness of your police fire services and may need to modify them, adjust them, et cetera, relative to the community needs, et cetera. The next policy is, there's one left out. There were two left out here. I apologize. 12 is that we will have efficient resources, so you want to make sure that your police department, your fire departments have the appropriate equipment besides personnel to indeed fight the fires. So we think about fire trucks, we think about police facilities, et cetera. And then we also, 113, want to have a good recruitment of employees, talented pool of safety candidates who have the skills and values to make those services, police and fire, work for this community. So any questions about this section? Yes, Ruben.
Would also, maybe with respect to fire, in 2003, where I live, a triage system was put in place by the fire department to save homes farther east of our block. They basically had to leave our block and go elsewhere and protect those homes down the line. As a consequence, we lost 19 homes on our block. So just that the public knows that may be a tactic the fire department may have to use, a triage type of methodology to save homes down the line. I wasn't aware of that at the time, but we were asking the fire department why were they on our block, and they kept on moving down the line, east and east, to save those homes further down as the fire kept on moving east and burning those homes on Del Rosa, which happened. They did save homes, but 19 or at least 20-something homes were burned on the block I lived. So that may be something that should be at least cited within the general plan, that there be a tactic that a fire department may have to utilized.
Actually, if I can kind of piggyback on that, because I was going to make a comment. I know we discussed this several meetings ago, and I don't remember the context.
Right.
But San Bernardino, all of Southern California, we live in this incredibly complex labyrinth of government agencies and authorities. And each one sets up its own public communications channel in the event of emergencies. And it's very difficult for the public to know who to listen to because, you know, part of it's controlled by Caltrans, part of it's controlled by County Fire, part of it's controlled by the city, part of it's controlled by, name an agency. What we really need is a single communications channel for the city and to educate the residents on how to access that, where we can get clear, concise information, as you described, about, firefighting tactics. That's, it's timely and it's accurate, and we don't have agencies stepping on each other's toes because they're not sufficiently coordinated. But, with our risks of wildfire and earthquake and, other, train disasters, we really need that single point of authoritative information.
Yeah, and that was in the safety element when we were discussing that a few weeks ago, and that text is being added into the policy statements as well, very importantly well. And it obviously overlaps a little bit with what we have here being addressed as well. So it'll be basically a similar approach. Good, excellent point.
On 1.3, community engagement, you didn't mention neighborhood associations. And I think they should be mentioned because they become a pretty strong group in San Bernardino and do all kinds of prevention things. In fact, they supersede the Neighborhood Watch programs because Neighborhood Watches in years before were started by the police department, which no longer has any time to do that. And the neighborhood associations have kind of done that.
Superseded what they're
And
what they used to do.
if you could, you can leave neighborhood watch programs, and maybe you also mentioned neighborhood associations, because they're focused on the neighborhood and all things in the neighborhood.
Okay.
Okay.
Good, excellent, thank you. Anything else in this section? So we'll move ahead to our educational programs, our schools, et cetera, in our community. So obviously, our policies are relatively limited in the sense that the city doesn't write the programs for what the school does. They're the curricula or the facilities or how they manage their facilities, et cetera. But there's the opportunity for the city to work with the education, the providers, et cetera, to achieve particular, if you will, objectives, meet particular objectives for the city itself. So, the basic goal is we're going to provide for the educational needs of the city's residents and integrate higher educational facilities into the fabric, et cetera. I think there's some notion we've heard about the higher educational facilities being islands apart from the community, and indeed how those become better integrated into the community itself, et cetera. So 2.1 is a policy about working with the school districts, just as I said, to be a part, to provide the services that are needed. That where it's appropriate, 2.2, again, large-scale new development will occasionally need to be providing land, dedicating land. In some cases, they do that. There's obviously limitations on what our requirements are for development, but this goes back to that, what I call the nexus between schools. We know what the school taxes are, et cetera. Been a big issue in California since Prop 13, but indeed, basically, as development comes on board, there's the appropriate mechanism to assess the appropriate level of fees to create this. And this goes back to Joel's concerns about how many fees can we assess. But school fees are basically a state mandated, if you will, function for us to deal with as well. Where there is a shortfall of traditional revenue, basically there may be some alternative funding sources and programs available. This again goes into other kinds of grants and programs that may be out there. Educational foundations exist out there, corporate foundations, et cetera, to indeed provide, and sometimes corporate foundations provide for programs the school districts themselves cannot provide for as well. We often find corporate sponsors for food service programs within schools, et cetera, so that it doesn't mean all the city flows through the taxation problems as well. Basically, the 2.4 is that there's adequate educational service provided for youth, and that the entities, and it's just, again, it's the schools, districts who do this, who modify their curricula over time to meet the needs, but this is just a policy that the city will work with them to provide intel and support where that is needed as well. 2.5 is obviously, we mentioned adult education, indeed, as an important priority for the future, and working with the school districts as well as private. This doesn't say this, we probably needed that. There are also private institutions that sometimes will also provide for adult educational, et cetera. So, any comments or questions?
No comment.
No comments?
No.
Okay.
Move on.
Let's move on to community arts and culture. We know, again, for anybody who's been around San Bernardino for any time, knows that the arts groups within the city are very active. They're one of the most active groups within the city, et cetera. So the policy is supporting the arts and cultural facilities and programs for the residents is the basic goal. And indeed, 3.1 is to have a arts master plan prepared, et cetera, and updated on a periodic basis. 3.2 is a city will continue to support and provide support public and private arts activities. For example, we have the Arts Festival downtown that was one of our earlier pop-up workshops we did for the general plan and other means of participation, and there are various ways to support that arts activities. Again, 3.3 is to work with the entities, providing public and private organizations to coordinate the arts programs as well. So you may have and this relates back to indeed the parks master plan that is being worked on, which will have a arts component related to it as well. 3.4 is that as we have public facilities and public buildings, we incorporate public art into those buildings and those spaces that are created, and so forth. And then the potential feasibility, 3.5 is not a mandate, but to evaluate the feasibility over time. We heard the high priority for a Center for Performing Arts as a regional center to attract people into the city. And then to 3.6 is if we're going to have arts programs that we again have communication. What are those programs? Everything from your street banners to flyers to online web postings, city council announcing an arts event coming up, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Any questions on these policies?
No comment.
Okay.
Point.
Let's move on to, this again is sort of a very high-level umbrella level about the public facilities themselves and the quality of it. And I'll just, generally go through these a little bit quickly. The arts, change the slide, is basically that there may be areas of this community, just like we have poor areas of the city that may need to have some type of local public facility, and there's a public need, maybe a community center, it may be tied into the parks, it may be some other kind of public facility. So the 4.1 is to prioritize, to identify those locations in the community where there is a specific need and something is missing, there's a gap, and they will prioritize those locations for future public facilities and services where there are gaps. 4.2 is related to it. It's basically saying that if you're going to do that, you need to have a methodology for how you're going to do it, and that it might be tied into your annual CIP program or capital improvement program, et cetera. 4.3 really builds upon that. These are related. One another is that they're equitably distributed. One area of town doesn't have a lot of public services and facilities, and other areas of town have none, if you will. And indeed, 4.4 is related to that, is it will have access to all public facilities and services, both physical and digital access, because we're indeed a lot of services now are by accessing the web page, and you click onto a particular city department or other service, and or the parks program, you can find out what the programs are and find out information as well. 4.5 is, again, similar. Again, you see a common theme through some of these policies that we've developed about on a recurring basis, evaluating those services that we're providing, the city is providing, and saying, you know, are we not providing enough services, and do we need to update our service programs to meet these needs over time as well? 4.6 is specifically related to the downtown and is elaborated more in the downtown specific plan, but to also notice the opportunity that this is the opportunity to create a special place in the downtown that is a community gathering place for the community at large, not just visitors from out of town. And then obviously library materials themselves, the library materials are to meet the reflecting needs and interests of the community. Libraries are drifting away from the traditional hardcover kind of libraries to online, and you get actually incredible amounts of access on online resources these days. Any comments, questions on this section?
Yeah, you know, a lot of people, including myself, didn't realize what a library system we have in the city. And you belabor old things, but at one time we had a mayor that wanted to close them all to save money, and that was the wrong place to do it. And I'm not really attuned to it. My wife goes to the meetings or libraries a lot, but there's other things going on in the library for kids and for older people just to get involved. It's much more intense, nothing the right term, but involved or than I ever realized. It's one of those things that like, oh, okay, it's a library, in my old days of a library, you know. And they have a lot of, I can't really speak intelligently about it, but they are very diverse. Not just
Yeah, it's not just books. You think of the old days as books, but there are
Right.
also educational programs. We talked about adult education, we talked about youth education, et cetera. If you've ever been to in downtown Seattle, the Seattle Public Library, the entire ground floor of the Seattle Public Library is nothing but laptop computers, or maybe not laptops, but computers that people can then access in for any purpose. And it's a very social and a very community gathering. So it's an educational function beyond just being the old cliche of dusty books sitting on the shelves, et cetera, that you would use as well. So they're very multi-purpose now. In terms of how they've evolved over time, much more, you know, have access to digital imagery. Some libraries will have movies. You can have your kids watch a movie, a whole series of different resources.
you know, the point is, it's not like just books and print. And it's
Yeah, exactly. They're much more.
Yeah, it's very fascinating.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Actually, before coming here, I spent some time at the library today. It was a nice place to hang out, and it was really nice. I went upstairs. This is the Norman Fieldham Library on 6th Street, and they have a session where someone was teaching someone. There was a class on speaking English, and so there was like a very nice lady that was teaching like a small class of, I think mostly seniors, on how to speak English, and they were really patient about it. And there's like, you know, a lot of services upstairs, and that was really nice.
Cool.
Okay, anything else on this section? Okay. If not, we'll move on to, again, topic of design, operation, maintenance. And they're basically, You want any public facility to be efficiently operated. You want to maintain it. It's got to be physically in good shape, et cetera. You want to incorporate, if any facility, be it a library, be it a police station, so this applies to all kind of public facilities, be it city hall, whatever, that any buildings are constructed to be energy and water efficient, partly back to some of the earlier policies we dealt with as well, and promote sustainability, energy efficiency, and resiliency due to climate change as well. And then we want them to be safe. 5.4 is not, it's not only the parks being safe, but it's also any other kind of public place where the people can come to, residents can come together. You want them to be safe, so they need to lay them out to be safe and provide the appropriate security mechanisms as well. Any comments on this section?
Small little neighborhood libraries also have a place. I attended one on Marshall and Mountview. I love that little neighborhood. That little library there. It's great. The program that the kids there in the area is wonderful.
Good.
Protecting little neighborhood libraries is just really important.
Okay. If not, we'll move on to the last two goals. Again, as we've talked about the importance of public participation throughout all of these various topics, we've dealt with parks and public facilities, et cetera. We, again, I think back to something, Ed, you said about not knowing about, if you will, what is available. This is, again, goes back to there needs to be the way to communicate information, city provide information about what is out there, what is accessible, and promote the access to these facilities and how easily, and provide information sort of like this relative to the concern about safety that Joel raised about this one point of, if you will, communication. You also want to make sure there's some point of communication within the city to inform about the access, be it online, but be online as well, and to encourage participation of the residents in these programs that are offered as well. 6.2 is the fact that, again, we have special population groups, youth, seniors, people with health conditions, impairments, low-income households, et cetera. You want to outreach to engage and let them know of these services as well, and be proactive rather than letting them coming to you going to them, basically to access those information. 6.3 is collaborations with, again, additional stakeholders. Just like we said with the Parks and Recreation, there are other groups like AYSO, I keep bringing them up, but there are groups of boys clubs, girls clubs, and scouts and others, et cetera, and cultural opportunities. Provide the opportunities for the community collaborations. And then you also want to just basically, in terms of public participation, work with and support the community groups who are out there, be it your neighborhood associations or other groups who are going to be providing services to their communities. Neighborhood associations, indeed, is a very important conduit back to the community residents about the kinds of services that are available, et cetera. So any comments or questions about this section? Nope. I think everyone's getting a little tired, but we purposely went to the and somehow the slide didn't get in here. Interesting. Okay, I'll verbally go through, again, like we did in the other sections, had a goal, you have it in the document in front of you, on financing of facilities. One, it recognizes that when we have community services and programs, it's not just city money, but we need to look at diversifying our resources, et cetera. City will, of course, continue to provide funds for the appropriate places where they provide funds today. There will be appropriate development fees, et cetera. And again, I think adding the caveat about the not impacting, the objectives, needs for affordable housing. 7.4, which is again not on the screen, is to require developers to incorporate art in public commercial and industrial projects, et cetera. Fairly common among other cities. Sometimes it's a % of construction costs. Et cetera, or to contribute in lieu fees if they don't provide it on site for the facilities. 7.5 is again seeking funds from other sources, state and federal funds, and then also seeking for programs, which is very important to do. If you have your parade, Ruben, in the future, you may want to go out there and get a corporate sponsor for your parade to bring in and pay for the policing and the services of that parade, et cetera. So those are the policies relative to financing and funding. Any questions?
I have a question, Woody. I don't know if I missed it, but on the goal number 1, community safety, emergency response time,
Yes.
is that going to include like a natural disaster team or something of that sort of nature? What is that?
The
basically
response
gonna do?
time is established by each local agency. So the police department or the fire department will set a response time, which becomes the basis for their request for funding for personnel, as well as for equipment and facilities as well. So that is established by the local safety agency, if you will.
So,
But there are there are federal guidelines and standards, et cetera, but it's the local agency that makes the decision on what their response time will be, their targeted response time. It's up to them.
so does that mean natural disaster is not going to be anywhere in there?
Nash, say that again.
Natural disaster.
Oh, natural disaster. I
Natural
thought you said
disaster.
national disasters. I was thinking
No, natural
the
disaster.
country comes
I'm
off of
sorry.
its axis or something.
I'm tired.
It's-
I also want to go home,
Well,
but I'm
yeah,
tired.
yeah, well, that relates to natural disasters. It's response time to that. We address that a lot in the safety element. Because there
Yes.
was a whole section in the safety element that's been several weeks ago now, but in there's a whole section dealing with response to emergencies,
Good.
back in that text, that section. So thank you. I'm glad I finally heard it correctly. Thank you.
Yes.
I'll make this quick. We mentioned with regard to adult education, I have a neighbor who attended the Inland Career Education Center there on, I believe it's Highland and East Street. Does the city have a relationship with that education center? Because I know that this lady has shared with us from time to time the difficulty that the school had obtaining teachers for nursing, for that specialty for nursing. And sometimes they lack funding to provide for those necessary teaching personnel to provide for adequate or certified nursing. So I was just wondering if the city had a relationship with that
Yeah.
institution
I-
in supporting adult education.
It's something I don't know.
But I'm not
No? Okay.
familiar with that program enough to comment.
Got it. Okay. Thank you. That's all. I'm done.
I have a question, going back to 4.4, which is access for all under public services and facilities. Where, so this section kind of talks about distributing these facilities throughout the city into neighborhoods where they're needed. It would also, I think, be valuable to put in there some verbiage that says, these really need to be located near our transit corridors, our public transit corridors. So they need to be, easily accessible for public transit. So, because I've seen several proposed or built that are actually rather difficult to get to.
Good point. Good point. Excellent.
They don't have access.
Added.
Do we have any public comments, Jessica? No? So then we'll move on to the director's report, or will we have to accept the recommendations for,
With modifications.
and then we'll move on to the General Plan Advisory Committee reports and announcements. Do we have any announcements? No? And the director's report or Travis's report? You are the director now.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll just kind of want to add to what Woody had said earlier. With the schedule coming up, we will be canceling the March 22nd meeting. just as we do, or May 22nd, I'm sorry, thank you.
Going backwards.
Sometimes it feels like it. Yeah, just as we, taking the hit with staffing, we do have to reassign some things, and we need a little bit more time to go through that final land use plan just to get everything together to bring forward. But I do want to mention, as Woody had brought up, one thing we are moving forward, rather diligently on is the housing element. We do have our completed draft of that. We received that, I think, just prior to our last meeting here. That has gone through staff review. We have commented on that, and we're working with, Woody's team, Mark, as you've all met here many times, on getting that final document prepared for the pending public review. And we're looking at getting that out. I don't have an exact date just yet, but somewhere, middle of this month approximately, at which point, we will, in a larger kind of outreach to the public to make everyone aware, we will let the committee here know where it will be available for any review and comment.
There being no other business, I guess that we will adjourn, and our next meeting will be to be determined. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Quickie, I know you can't answer. When, yeah, I know,
Don't
I'm
ask.
gonna ask it. When, okay, we're all the way in, supposedly till October, the end of this year. When is this gonna end? I don't mean it negatively.
Well,
but-
let me, again, the sequence. The reason, the land use plan itself, getting that basically finalized among you folks is an important trigger because we can't complete the mobility element section of the plan, because what we do for mobility is we have a traffic model run that takes all the uses that we have in that plan map, quantifies how many housing units, how a square foot of development, what that means in terms of population employment, and it then models, what trips are generated and how are they distributed through the circulation system themselves. And much of the mobility element basically, and by law, is required to basically say, well, you create those trips, your circulation element or your mobility plan must be coordinated and provided deed relationship back to those land uses that are being generated. So we can't bring you our mobility policies yet until we know, have done that technical analysis, that technical step. So that takes getting the plan basically through the process. The noise, well, one of the contributors is noise, as we talked many months ago when we had reviewed the existing conditions report, was the noise, the primary source of noise in the community. We have airplanes and other things, but the primary source of noise are the traffic on the highways. Well, we have to model what those noise contours will be based upon those traffic volumes on those roads, so you need that information to do the noise. And then the final kind of linear sequence here is air quality, which also then, which spins off of, you can do that at the same time you do noise, but you need the traffic, the trips to trigger that. So the critical path is the land use plan map, the mobility, and then the noise and air quality. That gets us to the end, if you will, of the sequence as well. And so that's the driver that we had hoped to have in May, and for obvious reasons, we're going to have to delay that a little bit to that driver. But we will be as expeditious as possible, and so those meetings on those latter meetings will probably be again on a consolidated 2-week schedule like we've been in this to get through in a timely manner. The reality is, if I were to, I won't say if I were to bet on this, well, I'll never say that, and I won't say if I'm a betting man or whatever, I think we're realistically looking at concluding this around the first of the year.
Yeah, I didn't mean that negatively, even though it sounded.
No, I was being realistic, I know, and
Yeah.
you people have lives. We appreciate,
meanwhile,
we
I
appreciate
mean-
your endurance.
Meanwhile, the people that are setting these regulations are changing them faster than we can accommodate them, right?
Well, most of the regulations are related to housing.
Right.
And this housing element puts that to bed for this cycle. And for 8 years, it'll be to bed as when this document gets up to the state.
understand.
regardless of what's changed. Yeah, I've been following Mr. Wiener's latest